Alright, well, let's try this again. I recorded this episode once, Cryptid number 3, and I wasn't really satisfied with the results, so I'm going to retake it here. And this is a continuation of my previous episode where I talked a lot about, especially Marx, Lenin, and Mao, and at least, my interpretations, very broadly speaking, of what they contribute to leftist thinking and kind of what they're about most centrally. Again, in my reading of them, that isn't a universal thing by any means, and I'm condensing a lot in here in a way that probably I'll expand later. Perhaps, they'll even make more sense when I elaborate, maybe way down the line even. But, suffice to say, this is the episode where I continue that and talk about slightly less well-known leftist authors, etc., who I think are notable. We'll talk a bit about Jay Sakai. We'll talk about settler colonialism, which is kind of my own area of primary interest and, application of Marxist theories in a novel way, I like to think at least. I'll talk about some of my own concepts. I think they're mostly my own, honestly. I think these are fairly original, although I've seen people talk in similar terms. I think my encapsulation of them will be interesting to you. We'll talk about an idea I have called ownership dictatorship, settler fascism, these conditions describing first world, these words describing first world political conditions. And the point of this is, we'll talk about a few other people, including, Karl von Clausewitz, a really great strategic thinker, and the way I think leftists need to be incorporating strategy and strategic thought in a dialectical manner and all this kind of other stuff. And so there's a lot to talk about. And, one of the things I did in my earlier episodes was, not my earlier, the earlier take of this episode was, I felt I was a little bit too angry in that, at the beginning especially, I characterized the Western left, because that's where I live and what I'm principally concerned with the organization of myself. And I was pretty, I don't know, I guess rude about the fact that I consider most of the ongoing kind of leftist people and projects in the North American context pretty pathetic and insignificant, and I don't really have a high opinion of them, and I don't really have a high opinion of most of the YouTube left, and as I've mentioned in a previous video, I don't really want to be a YouTuber. I want to do leftist theory, and if I can put it out through YouTube, so much the better, great. If I get kicked off of YouTube for stuff I say, which I don't think would be unexpected at all, I'd go somewhere else and try and do some other thing, that's fine. So I don't mean to slander a bunch of other YouTubers, although I will make some perhaps rather critical remarks on in general what I think about them and their political projects. And I don't identify, as I've said in previous videos, with really any of the leftist kind of trends or groups or what have yous on YouTube. So what I'm going to try and do in this video is lay out some original stuff that I think is hopefully pointing towards, or maybe even itself, motivating and part of a political trend that I hope I can encourage or participate in to the extent that I think it does exist to some extent. Looking at the realist prospects of the American left, what it would mean for there to be an American, a Western left, a North American, an international left that is really internationally victorious, that implements socialism and communism on a world scale, on a national scale, consistently on a world scale eventually. These are questions that, in theory, people ought to be interested, but I don't find there's a lot of discussion of it. One of my criticisms here will be is that we have a very strong focus in leftist content, on commentary, on criticism, and this is laudable in a number of contexts, but the problem right now is, especially in a world where, you really can build a sort of brand in leftism. There are leftist publishers, there are leftist YouTubers, there are these people who do this stuff, but there's no leftist movement. There's no anti-capitalist movement of any consequence in the North American world. There's a handful of regional projects, and even then, maybe a few things you'd consider at maybe sort of a state level. I don't even really think that's plausible, but nonetheless, there are a whole lot of people constantly talking about leftism on Twitter and on YouTube and all these platforms that they insist are very important and very useful and are converting people. Central part of my problem here is that I don't think we're really converting that many people. I don't think converting people to leftism in the current tradition as it exists right now is all that meaningful. And I don't think doing it will really succeed at more or less anything. And I think an honest evaluation of the left over the last... I mean, I'd go back at least to, again, in North America, to the 70s. There's almost nothing. There's no real victories, and there's almost no real anti-capitalists. There's some that come up, and again, there are some that exist on a quite local scale, but there are none that really get even a kind of state-level prominence, let alone a state in the American, provincial perhaps, provincial or state, rather than federal or national. You know what I mean? So there is a real problem here in that. Nonetheless, there's anarchist book fairs, and there's publishers, and there's people who write, and there's bloggers, and there's critics, and there's all sorts of ways of thinking associated with some leftist thinkers. I mean, deconstructionism and these sort of things. They're more left than they are right, although they're not Marxist, certainly. And a lot of that is in media, is in higher education, is in academia and all this kind of stuff. There are those people who do that. But nonetheless, there's no left. And I'm one of those people who, when people on the right say that the left is doing this, as they sometimes do, the left is doing this or that or this, or that the left controls the media, they control Disney, that's laughable. That's again, in my basing here, the left is anti-capitalist. That is what distinguishes it from other political factions. Liberals can be like anti-patriarchy to an extent, but they fail insofar as they aren't Marxist feminists, and they aren't able to actually get to the materialist basis of gender and sex and orientation and related dispossessions. And in a general sense, we overestimate the extent to which the left has influence, because there are some trends in society that we sort of like the acceptance of trans people in recent years. That's a good thing. It's not being caused by the left. There's no anti-capitalist is behind that. No anti-capitalist is organizing or articulating a theory of trans anti-capitalism on any major real scale. That would be a laughable thing to suggest as being behind trends towards trans acceptance on any level. There's no, it's not some foggy fucking academic. I don't know why foggy would be the adjectives, but that's just what came to mind. But it's kind of a whole thing now, where there is a complex of allegedly leftist ideas being advanced, and actual leftists sometimes do get hit and do get attacked by that. People get that anarchists are leftists, even though it would be in reality laughable to suggest that anarchists, were the people, anarchists, socialists, communists, were the people who say got gay marriage legalized. Like, that was a liberal project from start to finish in actual political terms. There was no real anti-capitalist threat. I mean, the most radical stuff you get are some of the people associated with the anti-AIDS movements and some of the really radical lesbian groups, and some of that stuff is in the mix, but it's never dominant, and rarely even more than kind of marginally influential. And that's not me talking down on them. They've still accomplished way more than me. If you're even marginally influential, as there were, there were some left groups in the 90s that you could call marginally influential in the North American sense. Are there any now? Honestly, frankly, no. In a real organizational large sense, no. There's the parties that exist are kind of openly goofball. We all know they're just reading clubs mostly, or cults in some cases. That's no good either. And the idea of there being a real leftist movement is something that a lot of thinkers seem to shun in an active sense. They're so much more focused on these very broad ideas about education and converting people and this sort of thing, which I just find implausible. I don't think it means all that much when you convert people to leftism in a North American sense, and there's nothing for leftists to do as leftists. The furthest thing you're going to get for most people, and I don't even say this as a criticism, this is what is available, is food not bombs. And that's laudable. Those are good people. But there's no sense in which that has the momentum even if you think it is a fundamentally anti-capitalist project, which I'm not sure it is, but like, if you think it is, it doesn't have the power or the momentum to make anything right now. That is like a certainty, right? That's obvious by observation. And I'll just take a short break here. I've obviously gone on a little bit of a mini rant already here, and I'm probably only going to make it worse when I try and specifically characterize the problems with kind of broad educational and informational content on YouTube and this sort of thing. You know, I hope you'll find it interesting. And my point is not to be rude or to be overly critical here. It's to be critical in a helpful sense. You know, I think we need to be reorienting the left to the extent that we can do that and is a thing at all towards making itself a real thing and doing real things. You know, and I think that is hopefully a pretty agreeable objective, even though I think a lot of people might disagree with my prescription and with my diagnosis of the problem. So I'll be back in just 1 minute. Okay, so then basically, what is the problem? What is this problem that I'm going to diagnose and give the alleged solution to? The problem is that all the content doesn't lead to the action. Part of my subtitle in my notes here is theory isn't leading to praxis. But no one's even really doing theory. It's a lot of people kind of doing a bad Jon Stewart impression where you read the news with a goofy face and isn't it funny? And there's nothing that follows this up. I mean, what was that stunt Jon Stewart himself tried to do in, if I'm remembering correctly, kind of early 2000s early 2010s, Rally to Restore Sanity. And he seemed to really think that was going to have an impact, this one-off gathering of just, like, fans. Like, it's and I mean, he pitched it as more than that, of course, but that's what it really was. But we couldn't even do that. You know, YouTube fans, their meetups are social gatherings. They're not political. You know, like, what is any of this stuff where there are innumerable leftist figures and they're feuding and they're fighting and they're battling for their territory and their domination of whatever space, you know, essay people, debate people, the kind of streaming trend, the people who are kind of in the middle of it and do a lot of things together, the people who are kind of historically parts of left tube or red tube or whatever, but who are nonetheless, you know, kind of often shunted out of the discussion. And especially notable here would be a lot of, like, Black and African American creators specifically who have actually been around like a long time and then are kind of not really included in the group for whatever reason. And part of this is, it seems to be, BreadTube was for the period of time when it was really a powerful designator, mostly a social thing. It was mostly the people who knew certain YouTubers and hung out with them, and they had a social relationship. And that was kind of the thing. That was the real core of it. And now it's even more splintered. It's not even kind of that unified thing in that lots of the corners really hate each other now, and they don't seem to have kind of casual social connections in the way that certain older groups did. And also, they're not doing we're not accomplishing very much. Like, it's, you know, in as far as theory not leading to praxis, what I meant to say was that this isn't leading people to do things. This isn't leading to people taking concrete leftist political action on the ground. This isn't leading to anti-capitalist victories. This isn't leading to deeply anti-racist or deeply anti-misogynist victories. You know, it's leading, at best, rarely, with our tangential involvement, to, like, marginal victories, temporary victories. You know, like, and even what are those? Like, what, I'm sorry, the outstanding example now in the American context is Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court overturned it. There was zero response. There is nothing of any consequence that was done by anyone on the left or even really within liberalism. Really. Like, nothing at all happened. And there was a specific meme I remember about, you know, if Roe v. Wade is threatened, then we riot. Well, you didn't even riot. And frankly, they're capable of beating riots. They're not all that consequential most of the time. Lots of them have happened. They don't really accomplish very much, you know, at least in the political framework we have right now. And so I object to the proliferation of streamers and of YouTubers who really do just read the news with an awesome face and kind of make jokes. And that doesn't lead to anything. People aren't doing anything. It's not leading to praxis, and it's not even really generating theory. What are the original contributions of these people? Like, no, none of these people, no YouTuber, literally think of any. I'm not even going to name people because I don't need to. None of them are known for a kind of original theory or even really an original take. Some of them have hot takes, which are something, I guess. But as far as like, I think we should be doing struggle in this different way. Who's talking about that? Basically, very few people, if anybody. And that's really depressing. And the counter to this would be, excuse me, the older essayist format, because clearly I'm kind of mostly commenting in that moment on the commentator, streamer, debate area. What about the essayists? Most of them were just making nostalgia critic videos, but for Sociology 101 concepts. It was never a particularly meaningful group either. And I think we overestimate the degree to which, people have learned, very basic elements of kind of Foucauldian critique of some or another thing. Wow, great. Is it? Like, does that have any consequence? Like, the consequence for most of these people appears to just be becoming successful and, like, having a kind of YouTube career and having a brand and wanting to continue it. And in doing so, you continue to make leftist content in the same vein. I don't think people are making this content because it's doing things or accomplishing things, and I even think some of these people see that. But that's what they do. They're YouTubers. You gotta make, this is your career. You gotta make YouTubes that are of, comparable, stylistic composition or what have you to your older stuff, so that your people continue to watch it and all this sort of stuff. And so you get a lot of people who are leftist YouTubers, and what that means is you're a YouTuber who likes leftism. You aren't someone who is, and I don't mean this as an insult. It's literally just a fact that leftist YouTube in this moment is about brands, who likes what brand, what brand has said on Twitter, how that has upset people. Now there's basically, in any of these controversies, 2/3 of the people take one or another side, 1/3 of the people go, oh, this is silly. And they're all still just talking about that for the week or whatever it is. There's no sense of, okay, so like what proactivity or like innovation, like I hate to use innovation in an ironic way, but like what are people thinking of in a new sense? And again, I'm not trying to drop people's names here, but like, what are we doing? What is the left attempting to do now if all we have are kind of people reading the news and commenting on it, and people doing critiques of prevailing social ideology and even current trends that nonetheless we obviously can't interfere with. We can't stop them or even abate them in a serious way. With what power or institution would we do that? I'm just going to take a quick break here, but this has been the essence of my criticism of the current kind of leftist YouTube world, which is mostly just a world of commentary and critique. There is no sense in which this is part of an organizational structure or trend, a desire for an organizational structure or trend, an attempt to encourage any kind of real development or use of power in the real world. It is people developing brands based on criticism and commentary in the same way that you would develop a brand based on being, a cynical film reviewer, or, a kind of asshole who plays video games, or, excuse me, being a leftist on YouTube is mostly, and again, I don't mean this as an insult. I am not necessarily any different. I can't tell you in the now, like, oh, I'm currently a deep underground waging war on the state. Obviously, I'm not. But I'm trying to talk about, like, okay, what would actually lead to socialism? What would lead to communism? And call me crazy, I don't think a legion of kind of Jon Stewart knockoffs and people who wish they were as successful as something as dismal as the John Oliver show, like, I mean, what is that accomplishing? What is that bringing? That has a number of people who like it, who follow it, who watch those videos. What else. That is all it develops, is the world of the brands of these people. And again, I can't state this as a fundamental critique on these people. It's a critique of the trend towards, man, the left didn't have much power, hasn't had much power for a long fucking time. And it seems like the only power we have now is invested in making and breaking the brands of people in leftist spaces. And it's like, I find that extremely upsetting and dismal. And as I've said before, like, YouTube is not my home. I'm not a YouTuber. I'm posting these here because I want to try and get this stuff out there. If I get kicked off of YouTube, if I get kicked off of everything, that wouldn't surprise me, because I'm trying to talk about a subversive ideology in a serious way. I'm trying to talk about how can Canadian and American communists look more like the successful communists of history who took state power and attempted to resolve the contradictions of their worlds and their societies. How can we attempt to actually do that? And I don't think reading the news or making these interminable video essays with your avatars and your special weapons and basically just making channel awesome content allegedly for leftism, I don't think that's getting us anywhere. I don't think that means anything at all. And it is upsetting to me, frankly, when I see this stuff dominating the discussion of leftists in North America. Now, I'll make a couple caveats to that. This actually doesn't dominate the discussion of leftists in North America if you actually meet leftists who do stuff. I'm not very impressed by currently existing leftist parties. But go there, and what you'll find is that most of those people are just people who don't really use Twitter or YouTube or aren't interested in those conflicts. Like that is kind of a different demographic rather than like a radically different kind of person. They aren't really exposed to that stuff. They largely don't care about it. You think a lot of radical unionists or like people forming, like they're not centrally influenced by YouTube leftism or Twitter leftism, or in general what you'd call the kind of rhetorical left, the argumentative left that exists to dispute public ideology and to add little nuances to it, and essentially nothing else, and that's all I can really say about YouTube leftism, and YouTube leftism in particular. Alright, bit of an odd audio cut there, but let me move into some of my own ideas on essentially trying to detail a political theory, and this is mostly kind of internal to my own theories, and it'll be filled out by the discussion I'll do later in the video about the kind of concepts that I want to talk about specifically. I've mentioned early in the video I might talk about a couple other leftist thinkers. I might actually not do that, because I'm in a good flow now about talking about some of my own explanations of things, so I might not get into Sakai or Clausewitz, or I might only briefly allude to them, but I think you'll find what I'm saying here useful, especially if you stick to the end of the video. So, where and what is the left? What is leftism? How do you do anti-capitalism then if you're not doing it by making YouTube videos? Which, of course, is what I'm doing now. Like, what am I saying people ought to be doing? And to do this, you do have to take a couple of steps. And I hate to, be an academic and answer a 2-minute question with a 4-hour answer. But, that's kind of how you got to do these. These are really genuinely very complicated things. And lots of things are complicated, but few things are as complicated as, like, the mechanics of politics. Partially because, unlike literal mechanics, for example, where parts, not in actuality, always have consistent names, but there are efforts, and people can enforce those efforts at using consistent names. And though edge cases and questionable cases will come up, like if people use nut, screw, lug, wrench sizing, etc. consistently, you can actually aid a great deal in communication. Like, I'm not really an expert in this area of things, but I work in a factory nowadays, and I have to have a little bit of on-hand kind of technical knowledge that I certainly didn't acquire when I was younger. And so I've rapidly kind of tried to learn some of that stuff. And the efforts at standardization and at making those things kind of mutually comprehensible, even when they're not, on the same machine or whatever, that's really important stuff. Politics are hard because everything is fundamentally defined by place and time, but also influenced by things that are out of place and time. Liberal in Canada in 2022 means a vastly different thing from liberal in Canada in even 2012, in even that time period, and let alone the 70s, the 20s, the 1920s, the birth of Canada in 1876, or excuse me, 1867. There are all sorts of quantifiers and questionable aspects of virtually anything, such that you have to very carefully, and I don't view this as an argumentative project either. All definitions are open to argument just as much as actual arguments are, such that I don't really find argumentation very satisfying. It's so boring and slow. And if you're good at it, you kind of just learn that the best thing to do is trip people up rather than actually let them put their argument out fairly and fully. That's actually the way better tactic in actual practice, and that's what most people really do, realistically speaking. So, that's kind of a thing that's in play as well. But, so, left anti-capitalism. Capitalism is the ruling world order right now. Like, this is undeniable, right? What exactly neoliberal, late stage... the variety of other relevant kind of modern descriptors that we could think about. Capitalism is the modern world order. How did it come to be that way is a specific question. It's not a question of how could America have come to dominate. It's a question of how did America come to dominate. It is thus a historical question. I reject the moralism and the kind of principled accounts that dominate a lot of leftist writing on history. And I think you should examine historical facts from a deeply materialist and even a sort of kind of detached point of view. Things came to be this way. You can't change the past now, and you should understand that if you're going to do historical inquiry, because it's easy to get worked up about the past. But what you should get worked up about is the present. That's the real issue, and that's a big thing right now. I'm in settler colonial history. That's one of my big areas of interest and of proficiency. And a lot of this is related to questions of indigeneity in Canada and in America. And in general, my answer to these questions, not that they're asked for, I'm just some white guy, but to the extent that I have an opinion on these questions, I think you can't resolve them without further action. The questions of where do Indigenous people belong in Canada? Where do African American people belong in America? These are based on existing historical contradictions that need to be examined and studied and thought out and characterized. And there's no way to do that in an absolute fashion. There simply isn't. They're always a sort of argumentative case, but at the same time, I prefer that people look at these as cases in and of themselves, rather than, I've got to challenge that definition, I got to challenge that, like, sometimes you need to be talking about a specific kind of liberalism for a relevant reason, such that your definition or your particular terminology will seem strange and even objectionable to people, but will make sense to you overall. There's a variety of ways in which I've already gone on a bunch of digressions. My move to settler colonialism there was just for a very short kind of example, but like, the left means transcendence, resolution, defeat of historical contradictions based on the actually existing world order of capitalism. It does not mean kind of transcendence of fundamental anything in a certain sense. Like, it doesn't mean the transcendence of the fundamental existence of poverty. Communism is a process, socialism process. Building or creating socialism doesn't mean, okay, we've done it when there are 0 people in poverty. There are other quantifiers to that as well. There are ways in which that is not a whole measure. Excuse me. I've talked a little fast here. Wow. And so, to look at the left seriously, you're looking at a project that needs to be able to force questions, to force historical change. To do this seriously, you need to look at other leftists who have done this. And who has done this? The examples are not going to please some people. The Bolsheviks. The Chinese Communist Party. Communist Party of China, I should say. The Vietnamese National Liberation Struggle. Like the Algerians, the Cubans. Many of these, Algeria doesn't have a socialist government now, these are projects riddled with contradiction. But so are we. And we need to be understanding how they dealt with their contradictions, which won't even transfer to ours necessarily. They're fundamentally different, but will give us an idea of how we need to look at and deal with our own contradictions. This is already sort of a, will get me labeled the tanky, where I say the projects to look at are the projects that go the furthest towards long-term amelioration of social conditions caused by, unequal and contradictory development and economic opportunity and wealth and distribution. And those are basically state-level projects, or at least projects that aspire to get and to keep state power. Anarchist projects, I've mentioned in a previous video. I think people should study them, but I think they mostly fail to really reach a level where they are challenging on a consistent and widespread basis contradictions in society. The Spanish anarchists and the Ukrainians mostly are not able to do that. They don't have the power to do it. To the extent they do, it's in very limited areas and in very limited terms. To do that stuff, you need a lot of social power. And I wish I could do a 20-minute digression on what power was, but power is kind of the ability to make people do things. And it doesn't even need to be the ability to make people do things that they don't want to do. Sometimes it's the ability to make people actually do things that they do want to do, but you still got to make them do it. Like there's a variety of ways in which I'm already getting a little scattershot here, but power in a modern world especially is exercised, not perhaps chiefly, but a big element here is the use of institutions and organizations and tangible aspects of society, materializations of social relations, like corporations, like government bodies, like, even things like protected lands, like national parks. These are institutions to a certain extent. The parties, these are institutions. Like, these are things that act in our society. There are other things that act in our society, of course, but these are the ones that we will really see first and foremost, and that as leftists we ought to be thinking, how do I get my hands on those? When you look at what the Bolsheviks and the Chinese did, they built institutions that were capable of fighting and beating and taking over for the institutions of the old order, the organizations of the old order, the ideas and understandings of the old order. That is what we need to be doing. And, jumping the gun a little bit in that by the time the Bolsheviks and Chinese were doing stuff that intense and complicated, the situation was very, very, very violent and intense, and their parties had already undergone substantial development. We couldn't do that tomorrow, even if we wanted to. Of course, that just wouldn't be possible. Even if people, followed me heartily and immediately went, "Oh, I better organize a resilient, semi-criminal party." That's, it would be a decade before we were even close to doing the sort of things that the Long March or even the 1917 revolution required. The 1917 revolution, people often look at that in isolation, but you really can't understand it without looking at the 1905 revolution, which is in fact where Trotsky himself comes to prominence. Like Trotsky himself. I'm not like a huge Trotsky fan, but he's a notable figure. Like the Russian Revolution isn't even 1917 to 1923, 1927, sometimes people date it. Like, it's more like the 1880s to 1917 to the 1920. Like, it's a much longer process, and so is the Chinese Revolution. I mean, an incident that I always relate to people when I'm talking about this kind of struggle is the Nanking Massacre, and not the World War II events that have a similar name, but in the pre-global World War II days, when when China was in the midst of civil war, there was a period where Chiang Kai-shek basically hired a bunch of gangsters to just massacre loads of communists. Like, literally, the party was building institutions, it was getting popular support, it was leading strikes. And so the opposition, and I'm leaving lots of parts here, there's all sorts of diplomatic quirks to this, I'm just telling the essence of this particular part. And so literally thousands of communists are just beheaded and killed and murdered in the streets. There are, horrible events that go on. And this is actual political struggle. That's not a good thing that happened. But like, that people would do that to you, that would seek to do that to you. The same thing happens to who? Basically the most notable American revolutionary group by far, the Black Panthers. The paradigm of attempting to do real revolution in a North American context. The group, as far as general and specific power and character and content. Like, and when the state has to crush you, it's because you are doing things that could, in some way, one day, maybe beat that state. And that's what we need to do. We need to be beating, destroying, kicking over, terminating, terminate with extreme prejudice, as they say in Apocalypse Now. The state of the old order and institutionalizing our own. And that doesn't mean, okay, good, on the third week of June, we'll have destroyed the old government and put our new one in power, perfect. It means a long-lasting global struggle, and in fact means a look at the conditions of capitalism such that you know what to struggle against. We need to be looking at ways in which we can capture and pressure institutions. We can force institutional and organizational and ideological changes and concessions to us in order to wage a continuing struggle. We need to be looking at the nature of our state, of our organizations, of world capitalism, of the world security outlook. We need to be looking at these things from a materialist and a Marxist analytical perspective to understand what we should be doing. And that is a real problem right now. Doesn't seem like people are doing that. It seems like the left is mostly about kind of semi-humorous conversations about the news, where we keep getting things that we like defeated and trends that we sort of like but mostly aren't that close to participating in, are under siege. Like, I'm sorry, you need to understand that there's a YouTuber who I overwhelmingly disagree with, but who talks about this explicitly. We are in a kind of Weimar period, and the degree to which, I'm from a generation where queer was meant to be a inclusive term. I understand there's been some pushback to that, but that's to an extent what comes to my mind first. But when popularization and acceptance of queer orientations and lifestyle, et cetera, like, this is Weimar. People are going to be throwing those books into the fire and doing massacres like this. There is no materialist basis of support for queer people, of removing them from poverty, or from removing them from vulnerable situations, or removing the power of patriarchy or heteronormativity, or we aren't destroying these institutions. We're kind of settling them in for a long war and a long response. Okay, maybe heteronormativity can't just be hetero guys. Maybe we gotta let gay white guys in. Maybe they're okay, but everyone else no good. Everyone else no. That's weird. That's trans. That's the war that's coming, and it is a real war, and it is going to be an actual genocide. Conditions would be foreseeable. It's not a guarantee they'd go that way, but especially if you look outside America, queer people, frankly, in certain places, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a concentrated genocide of deliberate day-to-day exposure and pressure, but in the sense that they are in some places when they're found, and there are some places where there are systematic searches for them, not treated well and or just totally killed, so there is a sense in which life is already on the line. Same with poor people, same with African American people and indigenous people in America. Anti-blackness is worldwide. Look at the ways in which Africa, despite, I'm old enough to remember, hopeful stuff in the year 2000 about the future of Africa and about the future of development. And the idea that Africa is just dirt poor or whatever is stupid. You can't go to Lagos and still hold that opinion. But there's a real sense in which Africa is still a disempowered continent. Its countries and its nations are still disempowered. Its people are still disempowered and attacked and exploited. You look at labor conditions. You look at profiteering by more powerful countries. Like, these are real, lasting threats to these countries, these nations, these populations as a whole. And what is the left doing about it? Mostly complaining on the internet. Mostly. Not even really trying to fight it. Kind of just struggling to even perceive it, let alone figure out something to do about it. And my hope here is that looking at the nature of conditions in North America, which is, again, where I'm talking about in terms of what the left looks like. I am a respecter of socialism, the Chinese characteristics, at least to a certain level. Like, I live in America, well, I live in Canada, but that's basically America, especially from an imperial perspective. And the idea that I should be bitching and moaning about what China is doing when there are direct parallels with everything they do in my government, usually much worse on a much broader, more institutionalized scale, affecting more people. I kind of figure I'll let them do their thing. I've met Chinese people, and frankly, they don't seem to be rabidly hateful towards their government in the way that basically everyone in the West is all the time, but nonetheless never do anything and never stop it from doing bad things anyways. So I just feel like people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones as far as the Communist Party of China goes. We should, in the West, just be like, okay, maybe we should get on our feet after having been unconscious in the dirt for about 40 or 50 years. Then maybe we can talk about analyzing other countries and their contributions to socialism. Because right now we're making literally a negative contribution to socialism. We live in the center of world socialist and world labor and world queer and world liberation and world national liberation, and like the world center of repression of those projects. And we do nothing to stop it, and haven't for decades, haven't for generations. That's really depressing. That's really sad. It is the duty of people who have the comfort of living here to be attacking these advanced institutions of dispossession and demoralization and an attack upon the disempowered and the disfavored by the modern world order. And I'm a white guy in Canada. The favored in the world order are me. We are the people who are going to be allowed to live and to live comfortably the longest on the basis of at least presently existing conditions. And it is at other people's expense. It is directly at the expense of other people. People in North America, people in the imperial core, they do benefit from imperialism. This is a core premise of a lot of, of certain Marxist and later Marxist analysts. And many people really disagree with this idea, but I think it's do you think Wish is people in China love making that dog shit? They do it because it sells to you like overfed Americans in Lazy Boys, that's the market, and that's who they have to serve, in the same way that, you gotta serve overfed Americans a pretty lazy version of leftism too. So I'm going to take another quick break here. I'm talking in kind of 10-minute stretches, and it's wearing a little bit on my voice, but I hope some of the stuff I've said has made sense here. I'm going to try and talk about some more advanced concepts in a second here about the particular conditions of North America and the imperial core that make it so resistant to leftist change, especially leftist change, outside of the aggressive and confrontational and materialistic methods that I advocate for. So, see you in a minute. Oh, where's the fucking mouse? Christ. Okay, so what are the specific characteristics of North American states that I view as basically intractable to normal political pressure, and that these characteristics render kind of normal, quote-unquote, conventional within the system political organizing essentially totally faulty and impossible to achieve a kind of fullness of change, and also serve to dampen the spread and kind of destroy the momentum, to the extent that there is any, of socialist projects and socialist organizing. And the basic thing I'll talk about here is two characteristics: ownership, dictatorship, and settler fascism. Ownership, dictatorship is what I refer to as the kind of overriding political reality of American and North American and American-influenced, kind of the Atlantic imperialist bloc, capitalism. And this is the idea that the particular government and even state outlooks may change. Not only will the people elected to the government change, sometimes even the role of the state might change. You look at the adaptations of the New Deal prior to World War II and the Depression, when FDR, someone who is extremely secure, someone who has basically no ties to anything but the highest tier of American life and capitalism, but nonetheless not an industrialist, not a guy with a kind of particular interest in this or that subject, someone who would sacrifice in kind of any area to preserve the whole. That is a realignment of state priorities and objectives that is notable. So the government changes, even the state can change, but the status of ownership, and oftentimes even the particular people who do actually own the most stuff, that is basically invulnerable to political change. Ownership dictatorships refer to the fact that the continuity of democratically elected politicians nonetheless dictatorially maintain ownership states, capitalist ownership states, where ownership of financial assets, property, capital, etc., is the byway to both make and maintain money and make and maintain wealth and fortune, and also to contribute to political power and to gain political power. Ownership dictatorships are basically most of the Western world, and in fact even larger than that. I don't necessarily have the full ability to characterize, but like you would characterize certain states like perhaps Singapore as this way, very willing to compromise on particular aspects of state governance. You know, Singapore does not shrink from public housing, for example, which has been outside the paradigm of acceptable governments in the West for many years. But nonetheless, all political change will serve to maintain the continuity of the dictatorship of ownership, and not only the maintenance of the condition in which people who own things have the majority and the decisive amount of political power. They don't need to have all, but they have the decisive amounts. And not just that people who own things, but often the particular people who own things. When you look at American fortunes, lots of the old school rich are still pretty up there, and to the extent that they aren't, it's because they kind of failed to integrate into new capitalist economies, not because they kind of were, you know, hunted down and destroyed by the Bolsheviks, or, you know, they just kind of failed as a business institution. But many of them that are still around, business dynasties associated with certain major corporations, they're known for their sort of willingness to not necessarily be fully rigid. They aren't these kind of, you know, you look at the people who are conservatives responding to FDR in the 30s, who think he's basically like an actual communist and he's going to bring in Bolshevism any day now. A lot of those people, you know, some of them are stupid and are just kind of Fox News viewers, like Mike Lindell, for example. But like the dynasties of old money in America have proven remarkably flexible and willing to. I mean, look at the moment I'm reading Rick Perlstein's series on the 60s and 70s and 80s. I'm most of the way through The Invisible Bridge about Barry Goldwater. Or no, that's Before the Storm, excuse me. Before the Storm is about Barry Goldwater. That's the one I'm about most 2/3 of the way through. Excuse me. Excuse me. Let me pause for just 1 second. Sorry about that. Just felt like a bit of a coughing attack coming on. You know, in the 60s, Nelson Rockefeller is like a major figure of kind of liberal, managerial, Republican-aligned capitalism. And this is a response to FDR. They are somewhat critical of parts of the FDR program and outlook. And the New Deal framing, especially, like the actual New Deal coalition in the 30s by that time is certainly falling apart. And a big part of Prostein's book is looking at the formation of the Southern strategy and the ways in which the parties swap to the extent that they do. All that's putting it a little bit simplistically. You know, business dynasties and even particular people who have been long involved in ownership often prove to be highly flexible and not so, you know, doctrinaire as might be assumed in a certain sense. This is why, for example, someone like George Soros can exist. George Soros is a multi-billionaire who nonetheless promotes kind of tepid liberal causes, and it, you know, as far as like billionaires go, is not nearly as evil and rapacious as many of them. But yeah, that's kind of part of the point, right? You can be a billionaire who exercises agency, even if your agency is in a way that isn't always 100% in line with the most strict interpretations of the kind of ideological consensus. So there is a way in which ownership lasts in Canada and America. The political classes, the ownership classes, the financial classes, the business classes, they remain in power no matter who is elected. There is rarely any real challenge to them, and to the extent that there is, it's usually preempted and defeated by them fairly competently. They're powerful people and powerful groups, and they have a strong sense of the political perception, granted by the fact that they have a lot of money. They often own major elements of media and of publishing, and of higher education is often in the mix in terms of their largesse, and I mean these are people who they don't necessarily show up, like Elon Musk does on the front cover, but they remain in charge. A good example 10 years ago would have been the Koch brothers, who are actually a little bit less prominent nowadays than they used to be. But these are people who are literally just multi-billionaires who, I don't even know if they were necessarily billionaires. They were certainly high multi-millionaires, but, they could, like, a ton of the Ron Paul stuff, a ton of Freedom Works, if you recall that little organization, that was basically just Coke money. Just like, hey, you're a libertarian? You want like $5,000 to shoot like a fucking dumbass music video or something? Cool. And like that's a major element of maintaining a right-wing state. Now, what do I mean by right-wing state? So ownership dictatorship is the kind of overriding political continuity of the West. It is the fact that ownership classes remain in power no matter who is elected. Who then is the ownership class? And here is where we get into settler fascism. I'm going to have to take just one more quick break, and then we'll do a solid run on settler fascism and the concept I'm talking about now. Okay, so let's talk about what I refer to as settler fascism, which is what I consider not the kind of rule of continuity within Western states, but a specific primary characteristic of certain states, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. These are the most classic examples of the kind of settler colonialism I personally am focused on. But also, obviously America, and also most notably would be Israel and South Africa. And there are a number of other situations in Africa and Asia and South America. South America specifically, although I'm not, frankly, I'm way less knowledgeable about South American politics than I should be, and especially the kind of politics of blackness and of race and indigeneity in those countries. I know almost nothing about that, but that is definitely in the mix. But so what then is settler fascism in the... Let me just detour for 1 second and talk about Atlantic imperialism. The idea that the imperialist bloc we're dealing with right now isn't really just America. Like, it in a tangible way, like, it isn't even just America and its allies. Britain and the EU are aligned with America. They act in concordance with it. But they do have certain kinds of separate priorities. They do have certain kind of separate interests. And it's better to see them as a unified bloc under American leadership than just people who are like American allies and have to act at their discretion or whatever. Because mostly they aren't like that. They have much more agency. So the Atlantic imperialist bloc is America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Certainly Britain. In terms of historical conduct, certainly France, and France actually does a lot of pretty grimy stuff in Africa nowadays. They're infamously nasty. They do a lot of special operations kind of stuff. They had a terrible series of massacres in Mali a number of years ago. There's a number of other countries. Israel is a big contributor. Saudi Arabia is a big part of this alliance, although it's not an uncontroversial part. Japan and Korea are the kind of Asian outposts other than Australia. So there are other kind of things you can add into this as well. Germany as the kind of most leadership-oriented EU state would be a big part of this as well. And German industrial manufacturing is a big part of kind of Western high technology manufacturing and stuff like that. So it also has a strategic manufacturing and industrial component. So there are a number of ways in which we're talking about not just America, not just American imperialism, but a block of imperialists who who operate under the American aegis, but do in some instances differ from them, and in some cases even come into conflict with them. Maybe the classic example is the Suez Canal crisis, where early days post World War II, the degree to which Britain and France would be subordinated powers on the international stage had not quite been fully established yet, and America had to institutionalize a certain amount of discipline against those powers in that time period. But okay, so that's the Atlantic imperialist bloc. What then is settler fascism? Settler fascism is, in my opinion, the organic political nature of polities in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and America, South Africa, and Israel. These are the most core examples, although, as we'll note, America, South Africa, and Israel all have slight departures from the fairly unitary model of settler colonialism that Australia, Canada, and New Zealand embody. Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, you kill most of the native people, you take over, there's a minority of native people, they live on reservations or in disadvantaged urban areas, basically. That's pretty much it. That's basically the pitch of settler colonialism. It is a political order made by the dispossession and indeed genocide of the indigenous population of a place, who are then replaced as the consensus defining and building political participants of the land, if not as the sole occupants. The genocide does not necessarily have to be of every single last native person, although especially in an earlier period, people occasionally talk about the residential schools as being a turn away from genocide, but in fact I think that's wrong. I think it is a turn towards a further kind of genocide where, okay, I mean, if your literal ethnic heritage is indigenous Canadian person, okay, fine, but you can't exercise any of that culture. Famously, indigenous languages, indigenous spiritual practices and rituals were mostly banned at residential schools. So they were places that were attempting to destroy native people as native. They weren't necessarily trying to kill native people, every single one, no exceptions. Although you look at the fines recently, you'll note that there are quite a lot of fatalities anyhow. But they are trying to kill the native in the child, as a famous quote goes. They are trying to force them to be white settlers in cultural and political effect, if not in pure ethnic nature. And even then, the fact that indigenous people would be assimilated into the larger white population with no kind of markers. You look at something like the white paper in the 60s, which proposed to get rid of indigenous status, essentially in every way, make it just basically totally inconsequential. Then that group would essentially cease to exist after a certain amount of time politically. So that is the kind of core case of settler fascism. America is also a core case of settler fascism in that it involves destroying the indigenous people and then replacing them with white settlers. There is the additional wrinkle of the mass import of African slaves, which is not necessarily a dynamic strictly replicated in other settler colonial states. Canada has slaves, so does Australia and New Zealand, but they never have mass agricultural or even really mass economic slavery. Like, there are slave laborers in Canada, and there are especially coerced native laborers, but there was never the development of a long-lasting, especially like a geographically defined period, or area, I should say, where mass population labor exploitation and expropriation was the norm. That's not present in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, although you get something like that in certain instances of particularly intense native labor exploitation. Though even then, that's a trend of a particular time period, not a majorly lasting trend. In the way that you can go up in there's still like black prison labor, mostly black prison labor, is still a huge driver of certain southern state economies. Tremendously big in a place like Alabama, for example. Mississippi is big too. Alabama and Mississippi, probably the two most targeted states by civil rights advocates. They hated those fucking states, those viciously white racist states, as they were in the 60s especially, and as they still are in many ways. There was no really mass level parallel to black labor exploitation in Canada regarding native people, or really regarding anyone. There are some other cases too. I mean, Asian people on the Chinese people especially, but Japanese and Korean are also included in this. On the west coast of Canada and America, that's a notable case. One of the notable things about the internment of Japanese Canadians and of Japanese Americans in the Second World War is that it wasn't just a prison program, it was a property redistribution program. Japanese fishermen were renowned for being often, like, having a lot of expertise and being very experienced and effective fishermen who would often outcompete their white peers. Oh, well, we're shipping them all into the interior. What do we do with their boats? Oh, well, I'll buy it. Just offer it to me at a low price. Dealio. You know, the white government is perfectly happy with that kind of arrangement. You know, I mean, they don't want to go out of their way to antagonize the Japanese, who are, a reasonably settled, hardworking population that contribute to the nation, generally speaking. Even if there are certainly some people who insist they don't and say they're bad. But generally speaking, I don't think the government has any reason to go out of their way to antagonize the Japanese until you get a crisis like World War II, in which case, really, the claims of their citizenship and their Americanism are they're not totally neutralized, but I mean this is one of the really good parts about the Karate Kid, which is actually a fairly good movie overall. Just give me 2 seconds. And there's a good bit in the television show Community, which is a very funny show. I recommend you watch it. In the 6th season, which was on Yahoo Screen, was kind of a departure from the earlier seasons, but I think it's still pretty good. And they do like a school drama club adaptation of the Karate Kid. And as the director, who is that guy, Jason Manzatakis, I'm not sure what his last name is pronounced as. He's on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, if I remember correctly, points out the Karate Kid is about Mr. Miyagi, who is a decorated combat veteran who fought against the Japanese and others. I think it's implied he's both been in Europe and in the Pacific Front, if I remember correctly, although I might be wrong. And whose wife then dies in childbirth in an internment camp thousands of miles away from him. You know, like that is a really tragic story. And like I did my school on the west coast of Canada, where there's still like quite a big Asian Canadian population and quite especially Japanese Canadian population. And when I was a teaching assistant, I actually had a student interview their grandparent who had been a detainee when they were very, very, very young. And mostly he talked about actually how they remembered the experience of detainment when he became older. He had much more tangible memories at that point in time, of course. But really interesting, I mean, cruel and deceitful and awful turn of events, of course, but interesting and important from an analytical perspective. And so what is settler fascism? Settler fascism is the organic growth and creation of what the European fascists wanted in the end, but could never really achieve, which was a unified polity. When you try and build a unified polity that's already, been fighting about class and ethnicity and race and language for decades, as they had been in Europe, people notice and they try and stop you, and there are lasting cracks and contradictions in your polity. Well, when you can come to a continent or a place like Australia or New Zealand, and you don't necessarily formulate this plan from the start, but frankly, there are more people more people than you'd think among the early Americans and Canadians and Australians who think, I bet we could make this whole place white. I bet we could make this whole continent white. Native people, they're on the way out. Whether we have to take them out or whether they just happen to take themselves out, whichever, you know. There really were people talking about this is going to be a white man's continent. It is going to escape the lowness of old Europe and the kind of terrible divides of the aristocracy and the peasantry and the lack of land. I mean, it's no, minor thing that one of the economic consequences of mass indigenous depopulation in the 17 and 1800s, when land in Europe is such a back-breakingly powerful and painful issue, something that divides parties, it has a significant inroad into socialist politics insofar as how do socialists think about the peasantry and about peasant land redistribution. This is especially prominent in Eastern Europe. Land is available in North America. There's so much of it at various points. The Americans and the Canadians kind of just go, head on out, folks. Just take what you want, do what you like. We'll figure out the taxes later. Like the homesteading stuff. This stuff that is actually like a big part of the moral claim of America. That we came here and we built things. Well, you build things on a mountain of corpses, and you use the corpses as fertilizer, which is actually like a big asset that you couldn't have done without all the corpsing of people. You know what I mean? Settler fascism is the condition under which, people will say America is fascist, and they're mostly wrong, because what they mean is, it's become like Germany. No, it actually started more like Nazi Germany than Nazi Germany ever really became. America now is a country where there's probably, conservatively, there's probably 100 million Americans who would fight you to the death in a desperate political struggle to demand, states' rights and basically a reactionary understanding of America. To like 100 million, and probably 100 more million, who maybe they're a little bit more liberal, but they sure as fuck aren't going to get rid of America. They aren't going to abrogate the basic contradictory social conditions of indigenous dispossession and African labor theft that have built America in actual fact. You know, they aren't, you know. So we're talking a majority of the population, and not just a majority of the population, huge parts of the population of the world's most powerful country, in its industrial manufacturing core, in the core of innovation, in world strategy and military technology. These are the people who have an order that they can defend and that they want to defend and that they defend just by living their lives. They don't even have to live as combat soldiers for settler colonialism. It's already established. Just going to Walmart is continuing a certain kind of settler colonial dominance. And as leftists, that's a big thing to overturn. That's a big set of conditions to beat. And to beat it long term is the objective. There's nothing else. It's to beat them. It's to beat America, to beat Canada, to destroy the settler colonial condition. That doesn't mean, as some lunatics will tell you, oh, we got to actually send all the Europeans back to Europe. That doesn't really make any sense. That would obviously cause so much social conflict that it would just be an untenable idea. But you have to have a resolution of the contradictions of material poverty and disenfranchisement and imprisonment and attack upon Native and especially Black and also Indigenous, Native and Black and Indigenous, you know, Native people, Black people, Chinese or Asian people, you know, Muslim people or people stereotyped as from the Middle East or Arab, you know, like these are all groups whose dispossession is tied up either in settler fascism, which is the kind of the domestic condition of organic social control of settler colonial populations, or in the international Atlantic imperialist bloc, which is kind of the extension of settler colonial control. I mean, even American states, or excuse me, even European states, which aren't settler colonial, they increasingly try to act that way. I mean, there's a fascinating example in that, this is kind of gross, frankly, but there's this thing in Germany called Indian Spiel, Spiel being play in German. Play as in like a game. Although it's also the same word for like a theater play, but like literally it's like a LARPing as like James Fenimore Cooper's vision of Indians. You know what I'm saying? Like it's literally about like going out into the Black Forest in your like fake beaver pelts with a musket and running around and pretending you're the long carbine and all this kind of like it's really pretty frightful. And like, you know what, the Germans didn't kill literally the Germans, the French, the Dutch, who are still over in Europe. They didn't kill that many native people. They didn't come to America by definition. But you know what? They live in and they support the imperialist order that continues, furthers, intensifies, and in some ways ameliorates, but only ever in a way to maintain overall control, the conditions of Native people and of Black people and of other oppressed people in North America. So this is a long and fairly heavy video. I mean, I'm kind of glad because like I won't have to go through and splice a lot of images in, which I find very tiresome. But it is a kind of long, serious political discussion of, you know, ideas that I think are somewhat original to me, such that you can't just Google these things and get an explainer immediately. That doesn't exist. But I hope you found it interesting, and I'm going to make some more videos. I'm going to make a video 4 that will probably pick up the topic I dropped here, that is a couple other leftist thinkers that I think are notable. You know, Frantz Fanon, Jay Sakai, a couple other thinkers. And, you know, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope you'll continue listening. Thanks again, and all the best.